Oh, there he is.
Representative Henderson. Representative Larson. Representative Sherwood. Representative Stiff.
Here.
Representative Walters. Representative Zwanis or Dave.
Here.
Senator Anderson. Senator Guru.
Here.
Senator Kinski. Senator Salazar. Co-Chairman Nethercott. Chairman Nicholas.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
All right. Don, floor is yours.
Morning, members of the committee. My name is Don Richards. For the first 20 minutes or so, I'll be visiting with you with my hat as the co-chair of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. Then I'll shift and visit with you in my role as the administrator for the LSO Budget Fiscal Division and present the LSO fiscal profile. I also want to acknowledge the executive branch as they take the lead on writing the January report, and the legislative branch takes the lead on writing the October report. And in particular, the CREG, as I always say, is a consensus process with many contributors. And as you recognized yesterday, Amanda Sewell has made contributions to the CREG group for the past 30 years, most recently providing the estimates for state leases, state bonuses, and state royalties. And her services and contributions are appreciated. In addition, Caleb Simpson and Monty from the State Treasurer's Office provided more than usual amount of effort and information in this report. The theme of this report is practical and pragmatic, in my opinion. I hearken back to the September 29th letter from Governor Hirschler that created CREG in 1983. And he indicates at the time that early in January, the group would meet again to update, if necessary, their original estimate. This update would be made available to you, the legislature, as well as to me, the governor, for final determination of appropriations and would become the official revenue estimate of the session. Notice that he uses the term update there. But we did not modify every element of our forecast. We certainly could have, and it would likely have improved our accuracy in the near term. And then by the next month, we would have further errors. If there are considerable changes, be assured CREG will respond. More than one CREG member or associate reflected in early January whether an update was needed at all. It was pretty close, quite frankly. Ultimately, we started down that path, and there were some obvious changes that really did need to be made. And then you start making changes, and it's a bit like pulling a string. And you think, well, if we change the price on this commodity, why aren't we modifying the production on that commodity? In total, we revised 10 elements of the forecast, which is a little bit more than usual, but the net impact was relatively muted. The most important number of the day, to jump ahead to the headline, is $13.3 million in the general fund and budget reserve account less than you would have had with the governor's recommendation in November. So to put that in a little perspective, the governor left you about $50.3 million of unrecommended funds, $50.3 million, that you had discretion over how to use, save, return to taxpayers, whatever. Well, this 13.3 reduces that. So now the number is $37 million available that has not been spoken for in the governor's recommendations. On the K-12 side, there was a modest increase of just over $8 million on the school foundation program profile. And we'll get into that details a little bit later. In addition to the 10 revisions, I will also walk through each of those individually. I will also address two components where CREG did not revise and explain the rationale or justification for our inaction on those two variables, just because they are relatively hot topics. So to jump in on sales and use tax, Our collections have been remarkably resilient. There has been exceptional growth and strength in collections in wind development in particular counties. It is not widespread throughout the state. We also have stronger than anticipated collections in the mining sector. And in the retail sector, I would not describe it as people buying more goods and services. However, the evidence of inflation is quite noticeable. So people are probably buying about the same amount at higher prices. So as a result, our retail sector is up roughly consistent with the growth of inflation. As a result of these dynamics, CREG increased the forecast by $10 million for fiscal year 24 only, our current fiscal year. And recall, this forecast really does impact 3 fiscal years for the purposes of the profile: fiscal year 24, fiscal year 25, and fiscal year 26. And that combines to impact the LSO and governor's profile. This revision of $10 million is about 1.5% off of our forecast, slightly higher than we had anticipated in October, and this puts us right on pace. It also provides an opportunity for continued growth in FY25 as well. However, we have some cautions on the horizon as well. Oil rigs, whether you use 2 of the larger services, Baker Hughes or Inveris, are down by roughly half year over year. Oil rigs are a tremendous contributor. In fact, they're, other than personal income, they are the prime contributor to our forecasting model, both in terms of workforce in the oil and gas sector and the payments that those rigs pay on sales tax for their pipes and other commodities.
Don, what's the numbers? What are the numbers on the rigs?
Mr. Chairman, there's 10 rigs out there now, and there were about 18 to 20 a year ago.
Thank you.
In addition, on the sales and use tax, impact assistance is becoming an issue because, of course, these wind developments are subject to the industrial siting. And as a result, the counties that they are hosted in benefit from the construction by an increased percentage of the statewide sales tax. To date, $13.3 million has been collected and distributed in the form of impact assistance, and that directly reduces the amount of sales and use tax available to the state of Wyoming. We're on pace to meet about $25 million of total impact assistance, but these payments are quite variable and depend upon both the pace of the project and the number of projects that are eligible for that. Reasonably, we could land anywhere between $20 and $30 million of impact assistance on this fiscal year. In terms of investment income, this...
Mind saying that? Apologies, Mr. Chairman. Would you go back through that impact aid comment again, the one you just read? And then I think you said we would recognize X amount in impact aid, but yet that would come off the state's portion of sales tax, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is correct. So these large industrial projects, and it's not limited to wind, it could be a refinery, it could be a trona project. When they enter a community, the statute provides for that county to receive an enhanced portion of the state share of sales and use taxes. As a result of primarily wind, although there is some trona projects as well, in the first, I believe it's 5 months we have of data, 5 months of the fiscal year would be July through November. The state has paid out $13.3 million. We're on pace to be roughly $25 million on the year. But because of the variability in these projects, it could be anywhere between $20 and $30 million. So for example, if we collect $680 million, which is quite likely in state share of sales and use taxes, $30 million would be paid to those impacted communities, and the state would be left with 650 in that example, 650 million.
So Don, I presume that Minerals or somebody gets a regular report that has all of the funds paid out, and also there's a reporting requirement on where those funds are expended by the communities.
We do not get the expenditures. We do get the report on the amounts by, I believe it's by project and by county. How those counties expend the dollars, we do not receive that.
So I think somebody does, because I have assimilated that information before, but if so, I'd like to request it for just like the last couple of years. Go ahead.
The committee will recall that we had that in quite a bit of detail as we readjusted that impact aid formula here a couple of years ago, and I think we requested that. I don't think but the counties have it because it's required through is it the industrial siting? And so they've got that. I think we can get it.
Okay, go ahead.
Moving on to our second revision out of 10 is related to investment income. Since hitting a peak in October, the 10-year U.S. Treasury has declined from approximately 5% to 3.97%. Yields across the board have declined. Part of the issue is impacting the state of Wyoming's investment earnings, and specifically the difference between current yield and yield to maturity. So you could have a older bond which was paying 0.5%, or you could have a 5% bond which was issued more recently, and they could have the same income yield to maturity, but are paying in terms of quarterly or annual payments quite a different amount of income. When I mentioned Caleb and his team over at the State Treasurer's Office, they reached out and resurveyed all of their external managers. They determined that between October, I believe the survey was actually done in September, immediately preceding our October meeting, and December, 70% of the state's external managers are lagging their income forecast. As a result, this is particularly evident in the investment earnings of the Common School Permanent Land Fund. It is off pace by about $33 million per year. All of this, and in fact, CREG reduced our forecast on yield, or yield, which is defined as interest and dividends, on the Common School Permanent Land Fund by $32.9 million. The impact of this does not show up in any of the budgets that you will be hearing because it is guaranteed to meet 5%. However, what this means is less earnings are likely to be deposited into the Common School Permanent Land Fund reserve account. The other accounts, the state agency pool, and the LSRA, which generates interest and dividends for purposes of the general fund, are roughly on pace. We have higher balances, and we are benefiting from that internal investment ladder that is not bond ladder that is not subject to these revisions in yields. In addition, the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, and this is the first item of two which we did not change. The Permanent Mineral Trust Fund is similar to the Common School in that its yield is lagging. So it's a reasonable question to ask, well, why didn't you treat that the same as you did the Common School Permanent Land Fund? Well, we know on the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, in the first 5 months of this year, the state has enjoyed north of $50 million in realized capital gains. So CREG does not forecast capital gains. We have maintained that position, but we also do not turn a blind eye to capital gains that we know have been realized. So it would be odd for CREG to reduce our yield by $30 million, knowing that we already are ahead of our forecast by $50 million from realized capital gains. That's kind of my first comment about being practical with this forecast. So we left the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund alone. The Common School Permanent Land Fund does not enjoy the same realized capital gains. In fact, it still has carried over losses from prior years that have not yet been zeroed out, if you will. So that's why we acted on the common school side and we did not act on the permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust side.
And that takes it from what to what?
Excellent point. That appears on page 5, table 7 of the green report. And the changes for fiscal year 24 only. And the reduction is from $209.9 million to $177 million. As you can see on the far right-hand column of table 7, that the statutorily assured or guaranteed amount of $219.2 million is not adjusted. So all of this shows up
209 to what?
209.9 to 177. So it's a significant impact to that forecast.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
I'm a little confused on that chart. If we decrease that to 177, there has to be some money pulled out of that account to make the 219 guaranteed. Then that would lower the total balance of that account. Wouldn't that lower 25 and 26 also because of fewer dollars in there to produce revenue?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, excellent question. The corpus is not affected. So the permanent fund of roughly $4.9 billion of the Common School Permanent Land Fund is static. All of its earnings are deposited into an income account. And you're exactly right. The reserve account will go down because that is guaranteed. So the difference between 219 and 209 was only $10 million. And now it's going to have to take $47.2 million out of that reserve account. And you will see the evidence of that reduction on that reserve account, which is on page 5 of the fiscal profile when we get to that.
Okay, thank you.
The third revision to CREG in this January report is an increase in state bonus payments. These are bonus payments through auctions of oil and gas leases primarily. The state holds 3 auctions per year, July, I believe, November, and April or March. And so 3 auctions per year, we've already had 2 of them, and we've already exceeded our forecast by $1.5 million. So it's one of those, again, practical implications that we have 1 auction left. We're already ahead of things. We have increased our forecast for state bonuses this year, which again are quite volatile, by $3.1 million to a total of $5.1 million for the year. This is only affecting fiscal year 24. And I would indicate that the prospects for the upcoming auction are quite high. And the reason we would say that is we have a much larger percentage of the parcels that have been nominated by industry as opposed to the traditional nominations by OSLI staff. So if it's nominated by industry, it gives some suggestion that they have interest in potentially bidding on it. The fourth change to our forecast is on state royalties. State royalties in this fiscal year only, it does change, are entirely deposited into the Common School Permanent Land Fund corpus. So again, this really does not have any direct impact on available funds for appropriation. We reduced those for pacing purposes by $10 million for this fiscal year only. And to Chairman Nicholas's query, we've reduced them from $147 million to $137 million. This will have a reduction to the School Foundation Program Reserve Account in the amount of 1/3 of this $10 million or $3.3 million due to the structure of those savings transfers in Section 300 last year, where we were using state royalties to populate the $350 million and change to the Common School Permanent Land Fund. Coal, in particular, in terms of royalties, are exceptionally strong. That gives a suggestion that there are some operations on state lands from coal mining, whereas oil and gas, also geographic dependent, are not as strong as we had anticipated. The fifth change to our forecast, and I believe all of the remaining changes relate to mineral components. So now we've gone through sales tax, investment income, and some state land issues. And now the remaining amount of our changes or adjustments are on minerals. For oil production for calendar year 23, we have increased our forecast by 5 million barrels from 90 million barrels per year to 95 million barrels per year. For those of you wishing to look at that graphically, it appears on page 4, table 3. We adjusted only 1 year's worth. It's the current calendar year. We're highly confident we will hit that 95 million, as there's only a couple of months left to report. And
Go ahead.
John, just interested on what you base that on. Is it rig count or just volume being generated per well?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, it's volume.
Okay.
And what I think the story here is, CREG had always indicated that we were going to get to 95 million. We just got there a year quicker. And you will see in table 3, where we hold at 95 million. And the reason behind that is the rig count, to your question, because those 10 rigs are going to be essentially, hopefully, balancing out the traditional lost production due to the maturation of those existing oil wells and the new oil wells coming on. So you can see we've hit a status point in terms of the forecast. The sixth item for modification by CREG in the January report is oil price. This applies to only calendar year 24. We reduced our forecast from $80 per barrel to $75 per barrel, a decline of $5 per barrel. Oil prices have declined steadily since our October report was released, and we appear to have soft demand, although it is strong. Strong production in the U.S. and other non-OPEC nations. The limitations on production by OPEC have not had the impact on market prices that many presumed. This puts us.
Go ahead.
Is that being influenced largely by the changes we've seen in South America and production coming like in Venezuela? So is that kind of offset some of that decline that we thought we would see from OPEC?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, absolutely, as well as record production by U.S.
Thank you.
So this morning, yesterday, almost weekly, there are news reports of geopolitical risk. There is not much geopolitical risk marked into or embedded in the current prices. And one measure of this, it's a crude measure, but some folks on CREG use this as a thumbnail sketch, is a comparison between the Brent price and the WTI price, that differential. And the differential, and I didn't check this morning, but this week is about $5 of a differential. And when the world geopolitical activities really get heated, that differential moves to $15 to $20. So we're not seeing that differential price move, which tells participants in the market that perhaps there are other alternatives. There are alternative routes. There are alternative producers from which these oil can be purchased. So that price has, OPEC has been unable to bolster through their supply cuts. Finally, I would indicate that there is a disconnect between analysts, including CREG, and the futures market. So if you look strictly at the futures market, you will get a lower number than that $75 per barrel. CREG is in line with the forecasters. meaning the Wall Street investment firms. But at some point over the next year, something has to give. Either the prices do have to edge up, recognizing limitations on supply, or the forecasters writ large are wrong. So there is a modest risk there, but it's probably in the area of $3 to $5. Item number 7 of our changes relates to the natural gas price. We reduced our calendar year 2024 price by 30 cents per MCF from $3.80 to $3.50 per MMBTU. This is predicated upon storage surplus, both in Europe and the US, the forwards prices, and up until this week, national weather. We've really had one winter storm nationwide. And if you looked, Opal went down to what we call a one handle, meaning it was trading at $1 and change, which is unusual for Opal to be trading at that low in the winter. It has since recovered quite significantly. And I did not check this morning, but last I checked, it was well over $6. So these prices are going to be highly variable.
Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Mr. Chairman, on that chart, Don, I see that you're decreasing the amount of production. Is that just depletion, or are you, we're still drilling for gas in Wyoming? Not like we should be, but there's 3 wells still being drilled right now. And I don't know if the depletion is going to be that bad.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, we have kind of 2 things going on when it comes to natural gas production. And to preface those comments, we did not modify our forecast from October. So all of these declines are consistent with our October forecast. Senator, you're correct. We actually get natural gas generated from 2 different sources. One is those single-digit wells, 1 to 3 wells, depending on the time of year. But additionally, there's a fair bit of associated gas from the oil wells that is also bolstering. Nevertheless, with the exception of 1 year in the past 10, we've been on a steady decline. It's been an average of about 6% per year, just due to those legacy wells and the drop-off in their production. What is a little bit concerning, maybe even a little alarming, that 10 to 12 years ago, I guess we hit our peak 15 years ago in 2008. The reduction in coal production in the state of Wyoming is roughly the same as the reduction in natural gas. About 50% in both commodities have been reduced. In the case of natural gas, it is largely due to competitors in the Permian Basin and Appalachia, which are closer to markets. Thus, they have some competitive advantage. Getting back to natural gas, I wanted to touch on the second item that we did not change, and that is calendar year 23 price. I think Kevin will attest to the fact that that's one of the primary questions he's asked, and it's certainly one of the primary questions I'm asked by legislators, by policymakers of other sorts, by agency folks. Don, why do you still have $5.75 average natural gas price for this year? And I think the bottom line term response is, last winter, 2 months of $15 prices really impacts the average for the calendar year. And I am quite confident that that $5.75 is not low. We don't have the last 2 months, but I will be surprised if the final number isn't just north of $5.75, maybe even $6. And that is a testament to the massive increase in prices for 1 or 2 months and the overwhelming impact they have over an average of maybe $2 for the balance of those months. And Kevin, if you wanted to add anything or concur or defer.
Thank you, Don. I'm Kevin Hibbard, co-chair of the CREG. And yes, the key question that we receive quite a bit is if you look at one place on the price and look at the other place at the price, how do you get to $5.75? And what's interesting is on the western half of the state, you have Opal, which is driving that average up versus the eastern part of the state. So we just like to make sure that everybody understands that you have to average those two sources of gas because Opal drives up the average.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our last three revisions are quite small. We're getting into the point of maybe we're tinkering too much, quite frankly. We reduced our coal production in calendar year 23 by 5 million tons. The federal government counts rail cars. The state of Wyoming counts actual tons produced. We are right between 235 and 240. CREG estimates to the nearest 5 million ton. I think we could reasonably end up at 237.5. So it's not unreasonable to be either at 235 or 240. Nonetheless, we did reduce that coal production based upon the latest reports for this calendar year only. The last two items relate to Trona. And calendar year 2023, our Trona price had experienced really historic increases this spring. It was abrupt and it was substantial. However, they are quickly returning to more traditional prices in the roughly $90 per ton. Therefore, we reduced our average annual price by $10 per ton to $105 per ton, which is still roughly $25 per ton higher than just a couple of years ago. We really had that unprecedented spike in the spring, and the prices or the ramifications of that spike are coming to a close. It appears that the prices are trending more towards the traditional $90 range. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our last item of change was Trona production, where we reduced our production estimate by 600,000 tons from 19.7 million to 19.1 million for calendar year 23 only. Again, we have, I would say, some bullish prospects on increased production going forward. There is a new facility that will be added and allow for production. Nonetheless, also during the spring, there were some production challenges. CREG in October thought those production challenges would be offset by higher production in the fall, and that is not coming online as quickly as we had previously anticipated. These last three, coal and Trona, are, I don't want to use the term de minimis, but very minor in terms of the impacts to the fiscal profile. With that, Mr. Chairman, I do want to take off my hat as a co-chair of CREG and at least discuss a couple of comments on your fiscal profile. We have provided the committee copies of this in the traditional gold, as well as the tabloid or newspaper version for easier viewing. My theme of the CREG report, which is practical and pragmatic, applies to this as well. Perhaps the most important item on the CREG report here are the notes and not the numbers. So let me refer to two exceptionally important notes. On page 2, you will see the general fund, and we have an asterisk there, a single asterisk. And it says the governor and court's recommendation include the impacts of the governor's letter and the chief justice's letter that we have received to date. However, budget hearing revisions and the timing of the effective immediate appropriation from governor's letter number 8 are not included. So this one was a real challenge for us. This is just a tool for us, right? For policymakers, not for staff. It's a tool for you to judge how much you're spending and to compare yourselves against the governor. We worked very diligently with the governor's office and the state budget department. In his last letter, governor's letter number 15, which precised the amount that was effective immediate for capital construction projects and effective immediate for savings. And when LSO staff were involved in those conversations, we did not know that the governor's letters would change the governor's profile that was submitted in November. And there were two changes in those letters that you received yesterday, one of which related to cybersecurity for $6.8 million. He made that effective immediate. And when we gave him the numbers for savings, we did not know he was going to make cybersecurity effective immediate. So if we would have made that effective immediate in our profile, you would have had to do a calculation with 4 different numbers on multiple different pages to arrive at the most important number of the day, which in my opinion is 36,971,000, which appears on page 3, line 33. I think that is just a critical number to be aware of, because that's the amount of money that is forecast, if CREG is perfect, on June 30th, 2026, 2.5 years from now, will tip into the LSRA. It's also the amount of money that it has no call on it. If we move that $6.8 million into the effective immediate column, it becomes very difficult to come up with that $36 million. Staff could do it for you, but most members of the public, most legislators would not know, what 4 pieces to do. So what we think, we want to be reasonable, we want to be practical. Had this information been known, I think it's reasonable that the governor would have put in $85 million into savings effective immediate rather than 91. And that would have been it. Also, once you start making revisions on Tuesday to this budget or any of the other bills, this issue will go away. So we were just trying to be practical. The next point is, through your last 3 weeks, 2 weeks in December and this week in January, you've identified a bunch of little issues, smaller issues. We have not fixed any of those in the governor's recommendations. We will fix them when we go through markup. $429 shouldn't be in here. We'll catch all of those. If they were large, we would have put those in the governor's adjusted column. And our reason being is, if there is an oversight of $10 million on the governor's budget, but he still wants that $10 million to be spent, we would put it in his profile. The issues here are relatively minor, so we have not included any of those. The second note of importance appears on page 4 under the school foundation program. And once again, it is asterisk number 1, or 1 asterisk, excuse me. And these amounts reflect LSO's estimates using the most recent data available for K-12 model variables and calculations reflecting current law. Nothing particularly exciting about that, including legislative impacts during the 2023 general session, ad valorem revenue informed by the January 24 CREG estimates. Here is the key sentence here, this last one. By statute, Wyoming Statute 21-13-310D, ad valorem revenue to local school districts are dependent upon local estimates of ad valorem tax revenue for the current school year. So when we move to monthly mineral reporting, which the Department of Revenue has implemented with extraordinary care, what you've also done is created 49 mini CREG. Every school district has to forecast their own revenue, and they didn't used to have to do that. They could just go to the county assessor, they could identify what the assessments were for the current year, and that becomes their budget. Now it's monthly on the mineral side, so they have to make the forecasts. By statute, the school district payments are based upon the school finance officer's estimates. We don't agree. They're relatively minor issues, we're in the single-digit million issues, but there are solutions to this, and I think part of it is just growing pains. We're not suggesting that any statute needs changed. However, I think there is some education that needs to be provided to those school district fiscal officers on what numbers would be best used. And this is not a degradation to all school finance officers. Some of them are better than CREG. The sublet county folks know the local oil and gas environment better than CREG does, no question. However, because this is a new feature, we have some school districts that are not applying the non-mineral ad valorem assessed values. And those are known. That's not an estimate. We know what your property taxes liability is for this fiscal year. Many of you have probably paid your November installment. This is not a forecast, yet we are identifying several school districts that are not using the actuals. So typically we would use WDE's number for this, and we are not in this version. We're using LSO's estimate. We'll continue to visit with WDE. We anticipate that they will work on this next week. We anticipate that the Superintendent of Public Instruction will have a letter, not associated with this issue, but because of CREG, January CREG, the ECA and the model is slightly different. So we're expecting, and when they were here presenting their budgets, we expected a revised estimate. It could be modified by a modest amount, but I just wanted to put you on notice that that is an issue, and it's more of an administrative issue than anything else. With that being said, I think I've mentioned the most important number of the day. I did want to mention just a couple more things on the profile.
There's no hurry.
On page 2 on the general fund, on column H, just that $40,000 effective immediate general fund, that will go away. That was discussed this week. It was in the Water Development Office, and the testimony from the agency at the time is that $40,000 should be shifted over to 25, 26. So that is a bit of an error, if you will. Secondly, you will see that the governor's profile in column L and column N on line 25 is a little bit lower. And that is because letter number 4, governor's letter number 4, which is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund, the profile in November is $438,997 higher than the governor's letter number 4 that you received yesterday. So you got an extra $500,000 as a result of that for your own distributions. On page 3, again, I want to make it abundantly clear, column N, line 33, under the governor's recommendation. In column L, there was $50.3 million that was left on the table. If you shift immediately to the right, you see the number $36.97 million, and that's what's available to you. If you didn't reduce or adjust any of the governor's recommendations and you had $1 million increase for whatever program or process or savings or tax relief that you wished, that's where it would come out of first, is that $36.97 million. You can see the results of governor's letter number 15 in that the SIPA amount at the bottom of the page for 23-24 balances exactly to 0 in column H. In column N, that's the 25-26, you will see that we're underwater by $36,071. The only difference that is when you round in the spending policy. So it's easily adjusted by the transfer from the general fund to the SIPA. And it's just a difference in the point of the calculation that the state budget office or governor's office round and the point that the state treasurer's office and LSO round. It's almost immaterial. On page 4, a couple of key takeaways here. In the middle of the page, this is the first goldenrod that I think has been publicly released that shows the elimination of the school capital construction account in the middle of the page. So we've kind of put a box in both of those columns for 25, 26. That goes away, and all of those traditional revenues and expenditures for K-12 capital construction appear in the school foundation program, which is the account at the top. You can see the net effect of this is an increase of $8.3 million at the end of the day, and that appears on line 41, an increase from $597 million to $605 million. Governor's letter 14, I believe, did provide for immediate savings. So a little bit different than the November profile. And that appears on line 11 near the top of the page, columns F and H on line 11. You will see this is a redirection of school foundation program revenues. And so that increase of $265 million is because his letter presented yesterday was effective immediate to move those FMRs to the permanent account and rather than hold them in the school foundation program account. And you can see the net effect of that policy action at the total available balance on June 30th, 2024 in 5 months from now. Rather than having $661 million available, there would be $422 million. That's only the effect of making that savings immediate. In the bottom of the page, the School Foundation Program Reserve account, this account was impacted by 4 different actions of the CREG revisions, totaling a net negative $9.1 million. Kind of like the LSRA is the funnel account for all of the general operations. This School Foundation Program reserve account in the current biennium, maybe not next biennium, but in the 23-24 biennium, is kind of the funnel where all of the ultimate actions of savings and some spending reside. So this $9.1 million reduction is due to lower severance taxes, lower state royalties, lower FMRs, and as a result, that $9.1 million of less savings than you would have otherwise benefited from. On page 5, the top and bottom accounts have no change. So there's no change in ARA yet.
Going back to the school foundation program, by making, just because he's making that effective immediately, the question is, what's the balance today and what's the expected balance on March 1st or whenever the budget passes? Do we know?
We can look that up. And one of my colleagues can just check today's cash balance if they would. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. So we would have the cash, maybe not advisable on March, but on say June 30th or something like that. Get through the school year, but we are not in a negative balance environment like we have been in the past decade.
So theoretically, they'll need more than 265 million on it's effective immediately.
There is another policy item on that, which may be fodder for another day, as to how to best access those federal mineral royalties. That's the primary revenue source to that account that is not constitutionally or through the act of admission dedicated to schools.
I concur.
On page 5, as I indicated, that the first and last account, the PMTF reserve account and the ARPA account have no change. So there's nothing interesting that's going on there. In the Common School Permanent Land Fund reserve account, you will see a lower balance here in the amount of $35.5 million. And this gets directly to Senator Anderson's question relative to where is that lower yield on the Common School Permanent Land Fund evident? And that is the $32.7 million in lower earnings. And then, just as he was kind of getting at, I just want to point this out for the committee's edification. Line 33, investment income on the account itself, because this reserve account retains its own investment income. There's a lower corpus associated with this, as Senator Anderson pointed out. So you can see that 46.5 million has been adjusted downward to 43.9 million. And this is the investment income on the account itself is also being reduced. Second to last comment, on the page 6, the water development accounts, there's some relief here. There's no changes.
John, 1 second. So on that, it's a lower amount, but are you using the same? I mean, as we begin to migrate those funds into a more aggressive investment policy, you're presuming it hasn't happened yet.
Mr. Chairman, great question. We are presuming it hasn't happened, and the State Treasurer's Office has indicated that they won't until SLIB meets, the money is there, they change their investment policy. So there's a number of steps to go through before they can achieve that total return portfolio as opposed to the liquidity portfolio. On page 6, the water accounts have no change whatsoever. And then on page 7, I think this is a nice summary page. The first 2 accounts all kind of funnel down for both years, general fund, budget reserve. So all of those actions, positive 91 million in 23-24, negative 91 million in 25-26, all that kind of washes itself out. And another nice location for, hey, what was the total impact? Appears in the LSRA, because all of those numbers on lines 1 through 32 funnel down to that $13,333,694. And that's everything that changed on the general fund side. Moving to the school foundation program, you can see broken out investment income, FMRs, property taxes, reversions, all of those changes, again, funnel down to a net amount of $8.3 million. A lot's going on there, but the bottom line is 8.3. School capital construction account, as I indicated, goes away. There were no changes to the PMTF reserve account. And you can see that common school spending policy reserve account, both the lost yield and the interest on itself. It really is a nice snapshot of all the actions. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll take any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
Please, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Don, I wanted to get a comparison from on page 1 of the general fund expenditures compared to what we did 2 years ago in the budget. So let's imagine that we were all potted plants here growing happily like ferns in the corner, and we made no changes to the governor's recommendation. Then the general fund appropriations would be $3.729 billion. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. And we are working on a easier document. There's a lot going on here. So, but it's going to end up to be very, very close. We're not done with that analysis yet, but we are doing an analysis to exactly your point. There are a lot of moving parts, but a very basic question you, your colleagues, citizens are asking, are you spending more or less than last biennium, right? A super basic question. It's actually pretty hard to answer for a couple of reasons. There were effective immediates that crossed bienniums. There was the use of ARPA funds instead of general funds for Department of Corrections. We include in our appropriations for savings that are really not appropriations for spending. So those 3 items, we're trying to disaggregate all of those, and we actually have to go over 6 years because of the effective immediate implications and get to one number when you take out all of that other noise, and also outline the impact of each of those noise items. And I don't know, but it's very close right now.
And Mr. Chairman, yeah, that would be really helpful to have that, because at first, when I look at the fiscal note from the budget we passed 2 years ago, it says we spent $2.7 billion of general fund. This says 3.7. So initially it's this big shock. And yet it looks like there's $530 million of this current proposal that goes to savings. And then there's a lot of ARPA revenue replacement funds going on that muted the impact 2 years ago. Do you have a ballpark number? Because after I take the savings out, it looks like on its face, we're spending $431 million more, which sounds like a lot, but how much is it really, if you know, to the nearest 20 or $30 million?
Matt has taken the lead on this, and I think we're a little premature. We're a day or two away from having the number, and we will have it for you when you come back on Tuesday, and I feel more comfortable with that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And then finally, just sort of a technical point. If let's imagine we're not potted plants, right? When we have the number of $36 million that's sort of left over for us, I mean, obviously, we actually appropriate all of it, right? I mean, the governor's recommendation is, in theory, just a recommendation. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiff, you're absolutely right. It is just a recommendation. I don't agree with your statement that you appropriate all of that. Quite often, you will leave dollars on the table in anticipation of a supplemental funding. It automatically will flow to the LSRA if there's 36 million or 136 million. There have been years, I'm not suggesting this year, CREG may not be right. And if you, in your collective policy wisdom, believe that a recession is more likely than not, and our sales tax and oil prices are way too optimistic, then you may want to leave more than that on the table as a hedge against our fallibility.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going back to Representative Stith's starting question, page 1, line 15 or whatever it is, right in there, 3.729 billion is the budget based on this January CREG. And then you look at the governor's summary budget book, and it shows total general fund expenditure of 2.89 billion and change. Why the difference in those? Or how do you arrive at the difference would be a better descriptor of the question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, 2 points on that. Rather than, I think you're looking at the 3.7 at the bottom of the page on line 34. Is that? Page 2, line 34. Sorry. That's the 3.7, which includes the auto appropriation for the spending policy on line 33. So for my first point, I would not use that 3.7 billion number. Rather, I would use line 25, which is $3.2 billion, because that takes out your transfer to the PMTF, that takes out your savings, that takes out the spending policy. In addition, I believe the number that you're referencing, which we call the B1 sheet from the governor's recommendation, did not include his letters. So I think the chairman, Nicholas, mentioned $1 billion. That wasn't all general funds, but there was about, $300 or $400 million of general fund requests.
833.
833. But some of that was for savings, 200 or so. So let's say $500, $600 million. That's the difference between 2.7 billion and 3.2 billion, with and without letters.
And Mr. Chairman, I would also add it doesn't include the B1 doesn't include the judiciary.
Mr. Chairman, I do have an answer on your question on the school foundation program. Today's balance is approximately 585 million. You still have about 369 million of payments to school districts for the rest of the fiscal year. But you also have approximately $360 million in recapture that will be paid over the next 6 months, 40% next week, and then the balance at the end of June.
So
Yes.
have made a rough estimate of what will be there on March 1st or March 15th?
Mr. Chairman, it will be in the neighborhood of about 450 million. But you then have a liability on March 15th, April 15th, and May 15th. You have substantial payments still.
So we did not hear from the chief why it was effective immediately. So I think at some point we'd like to have some commentary on that change and the rationale for it.
You're speaking to the savings in the common school per line fund. Availability, we believe it is available. And
What's the logic of it?
to get the return and get the corpus.
Okay. And that's all?
Is that not enough?
Okay, Don, any other further questions? Anything else, Don? Any other questions for Don?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
brief question. What is Craig's remote work policy?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to Don for all his excellent work and the CREG mentors, Patrick Fleming, Edie Troutwine, Jason Crowder, Brenda Hansen's with us, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Rob Godby, Tom Kropich. Special thanks to Dean Kempty, Matt Wilmarth, Dr. Wyndham Liu, and Dalen Boehner. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Amanda Sewell. I have worked with her for the last 30 years. Thank you.
Okay. Next. Draft legislation. So, committee, do we want to take a short break or what should we rock on? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, we are back. We've got two retirement bills that we have had drafted and we have preliminary reviewed in prior JAC meetings. We have retirement folks in front of us. The first one on the schedule is, which one? 341. So please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm David Swindell, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Retirement System. I have with me at the dais Paul Wood from our actuary service, Gabriel Roden Smith out of the Denver office. In the back bench, we've got his associate, Mr. Thomas Lyle, as well as my General Counsel, Ben Brandis from the system, and my Deputy Director, Rachel Maker. Deputy Director does everything that the Director doesn't know how to do. It's a fairly lengthy list.
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to start with an overview?
Please.
Okay. All right, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, 24 LSO 341, working draft 0.6. This is 49-01 in the online meeting materials. This is the bill draft the committee requested at its October meeting, and this would increase both the employee and employer retirement contributions for the public employee retirement plan by 0.25% for each of the next 2 fiscal years. So on page 2, lines 6 through 12, this is in 93412A concerning the employee or member contributions, language that is from past years that is now obsolete as stricken. Then on page 2, lines 12 to 16, this is the language that would add for member contributions, 0.25% for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2024, and then an additional 0.25% that would commence on July 1, 2025. The staff comment on page 3 is just a reference to the language concerning the state employer pickup. If that language is unchanged, the employee would be responsible for paying those contributions through a cash reduction salary. Then on page 4, lines 11 through 18, this is 93413 concerning the employer contributions, striking language from past fiscal years. Then on page 4, lines 20 to 24, is inserting language that would increase the employer contribution by 0.25% for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2024. And then after that, another 0.25% that would commence on July 1, 2025. Moving on to page 6, these are the appropriations to cover the employer contributions that would be associated with the increases in this bill draft. And Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to go through each of those individually or take questions. There is one I would note, and that is on page 7, line 12. This is an appropriation from the School Foundation Program account for employer contributions for school districts. I have an updated calculation for that appropriation.
Go ahead.
And that would be $6,825,000.
Predicated on,
That's predicated on the appropriate share of the School Foundation Program account's responsibility for those contributions. I believe 9% is from other sources.
okay. Okay, committee. So we have the governor's letter that addresses on who should pay. But what I'd like to do is then have presentation to us on why this bill is necessary and kind of walk us through and educate us on, and re-educate us on that issue. Would you please? Can we?
Mr. Co-Chair, I have a
Go ahead,
Mr. Co-Chair, I have a question.
please.
I know we're only on this one bill. We do have 2 bills. Conceptually, the policy question of whether we're going to do it or whether we go to actuarially adjusted. And let me just lay it out. I'm more inclined to do actuarially adjusted than for us to run the same play that we keep losing. And provide in the actuarially adjusted that each party will pay their share. And so I'm trying to figure the most efficient way to do this. I mean, we can work our way through this bill and then work our way through the other bill. But at least just speaking for myself, I kind of know which way I'm inclined to go.
No, I think it's a good question. The question is, how do these two, if you can, Brian, how do these two bills interrelate? And do we need to do both of them, or how does it play out?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
So Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, there are 2 policy questions here for the committee to decide, so I won't opine on those. The bills themselves are mutually exclusive. The way I would describe 341 in relation to 342 is that 341 is basically a step up, an incremental step toward meeting that actuarially defined contribution rate. Either bill could be passed independently, or they both could be passed together. Those are decisions obviously for the committee. What I would note about the actuarial defined contribution bill, so 342, is that will not, the way that is structured and set up, would not take effect until July 1 of 2026. So it would take a full biennium to calculate that rate and then account for the changes in that rate in the budgeting process.
So if we passed both of them, then under 342, that would be recalculated based upon the actions that we took in 341, and there would be different numbers.
And Mr. Co-Chairman, can I ask in relation to that? Based on, I think what you just said, Mr. Fuller, it's anticipated that it would be more than the amounts in 341. Is that correct? Oh, the answer is no.
Mr. Chairman and Chairman Othercott, I believe that is correct. The amount that's anticipated, if the actuarial defined rate bill is enacted into law and would be calculated to take effect on July 1 of 26, I believe the retirement system would account for 341 if that is enacted in its calculation, because that calculation looks at the account as of January 1 of the odd numbered year. So January 1, 2025. So I think that would be accounted for, and the change would be higher overall than 341. So 341 could just be considered in tandem with 342 as an incremental step toward that ADC rate.
And then this is a question for you. So if we enact and pass 342, in order to get to the actuarial rates, we're going to have to go up more than 1% on the big plan eventually.
Mr. Chairman, 342, which is the ADC bill, which presently, as Mr. Fuller said, takes effect beginning in 2026, actually it moves slower than 341. 341 is going to move 100 basis points in 2 years, in one biennium. The guardrails on 342 are 50 basis points for each biennium. So it moves a little slower once the mechanism is engaged, just so everybody understands. And whatever, if you adopt a mechanism, then whatever the results are for previous manually adjusted contribution rates or investment experience or plan experience will be taken into account by the analysis. The actuaries would calculate the recommended rate, and then we would compare that to the guardrails and move as fast as we could in the appropriate direction.
Mr. Co-Chairman,
Go ahead.
in light of that, and I think in support of Senator Kinsky's, I think, idea is, I know we're moving fast, rapidly making a decision, but I think we dispose of 341, move to 342, and that also then disposes of the governor's letter.
Well, I don't think it's quite that simple, because with 342, we still will have the question of who pays, right?
Mr. Co-Chairman, in LSO 342, the bill says it's split virtually equally. It's actually 49.68. And that calculation is because the present burden of 9.37 employer and 9.25 is close to 50-50, and the bill mirrors that split. It leaves open the question of, and it continues to allow employers to subsidize that employee rate if they feel they need to do that, and that includes the state of Wyoming. It's a separate decision as to what we would do in 2026 if rates went up. But the bill just says it's split evenly, and all employers will have to adjust to that reality.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I do support that effort of splitting it 50-50. And if the governor wants to provide a governor's letter in 2025 for the 2026-27 budget, they can do that.
Well, I think there's one more, probably two more big issues. Over the long term, the impact of this will be a substantial increase or more costs to somebody over the course of time. And we will have to understand and so my thought is this is more complicated. It's a lot more expensive over time, and it will have a lot more.
Mr. Co-Chair, which one are you holding up?
This is 342.
Okay.
And so to me, the logical way to do it is to pass both bills out of committee, have them both set up, have 342 run first, and see if we can get it out on the table. And if we can't, then this would be our backstop.
And we can determine at that time whether we fund the employee portion or not,
Exactly.
which I would just, Mr. Co-Chair, I just say this. It just galls me that every time we try to fix this fund, the employees scream like heck, even after two pay raises. But in the 10 years I've been here, I've gone from $1.5 billion deficit unfunded in the pensions and the health plans, with his predecessor denying there was a problem, to now $2.5 billion. And we got to do something. And if the price we have to pay ultimately in the end is that we got to pay the employee share on 341 to get 341 and 342 into effect. That's what it is.
And Senator, I would agree with that, but also I like the idea of doing the 1% now.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Because it's cheaper, because it'll be more expensive too.
Well, no, I agree with you. I'm saying 341 and 342, and we can find out on the floor whether we have to pay the employee share on 341 to get the bill through.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The conversation is going as though we all understand 242 and we've not had that. It would be helpful maybe for the committee to let's go through, before we completely go through this, to discuss 242, get that on the table, and then make the two comparisons a little bit, I think would be helpful at least.
Okay. Now you, Mr. Co-Chair, now Representative Larson knows how I feel sometimes when he's asking questions.
Yeah.
So committee, what I would suggest we do is let's move 341 and get it, because I think everyone understands this.
You don't understand.
I know.
I would move 341.
Yeah, there's been, yeah.
Second.
We'll have, excuse me, public comment first on it.
Okay.
Any public comment on 341? Or any further discussion? Well, yeah. I mean, we can have public comment and then we can have discussion on the bill. So seeing no public comment, we'll close public comment. Is there a motion on the bill?
Move 341.
Second.
Moved and seconded by Senator Salazar. Discussion,
Mr. Co-Chairman,
please.
a couple of things. You know, I've voted on this effort, I think, numerous times in the course of my Senate experience. I have not heard the complaints from the public employees as Senator Kinski has, and it sailed through the Senate last year. I think it got sidelined over in the other chamber for addressing this issue with the retirement fund. You know, whether or not it saves us money, I find that hard to believe if we're going to go ahead and pay the employee share pursuant to the governor's letter. So for clarity, I don't support the governor's letter to replace the employee share. So if we're doing it as a cost-saving measure, that's just not accurate. And recognizing that it's just for a 2-year period. So if we only pass 341 and we don't get to 342, it's just this temporary infusion of cash that actually creates, I think, confusion. Mr. Fuller is giving me a furrowed brow, so evidently my understanding of its application is in error. Mr. Fuller?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Othercott, that 0.5% increase would remain until further legislative action. So it's not just for the next 2 fiscal years. It would increase by 0.25% of each of the 2 fiscal years, and then would remain at that increased percentage until the legislature acts again.
Can you show me in the bill where that is? I just want to make sure.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Othercott. So for the employee contribution, this is page 2, line 16. The key word would be "and thereafter." And then the same on page 4, line 23, would make it thereafter the 9.87 for the employer contribution.
Got it.
And so, committee, we will have the ability to discuss the merits of the governor's letters and how this bill comes out of this committee. I don't know, we don't need to have that discussion today is what I'm suggesting. If we just adopt the bill and make it a House bill or Senate bill, and then as we work together through the governor's letters, we can decide if we want to release it, if we want to bring it back up and modify it, consistent with the governor's letter.
Sounds like we're going to pass these 2 bills and deal with it later. So I think Representative Sherwood has a question.
Thank you. Just to chime in here, I'm looking at this, I guess, as a bigger picture strategy. The bill that we are discussing now, 341, I do support the concept. However, I do support the governor's letter. So I think I made clear yesterday. I think this is a nice stair step to get us to where we need to be in 342, considering there's some nuances in the modeling with our number of vacancies, and that will create, as we successfully recruit and keep our employees happy, and we reduce the number of vacancies, that's going to impact the modeling of where these retirement funds are. So I'm looking at, again, as a bigger picture, I support 341 with the state picking up the share so that we're not taking more money out of our hardworking employees' paychecks. And I also support then this bigger picture strategy that's presented in Bill 342. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because this is the vehicle, having a clean interim committee bill going to the floor, I do think the discussion of do we want to, of the governor's letter does need to take place now. While procedurally we may approve or deny the governor's letter sometime next week during markup, to then think we're going to take a roll call vote on this today and reopen this next week to take another roll call vote on the changes just doesn't seem like a very logical step. So I think if we're going to have that discussion, do we want to increase it based on the governor's letter? Let's have it today and then take the roll call vote and pass it out of here, however we decide. And I'm not at this point ready to take position on sides. And then, like I said, next week in markup, when we get the governor's letter, whatever it was, we just say yay or nay to it, but it will have already been effectuated in this bill because this bill seems to be the vehicle for that governor's letter. And so I think now is the appropriate time for that discussion.
So, Madam Chair, I would agree with that. But my question is there any more information that we want presented to us on the need to do this with our actuaries and what the ramifications are if we don't do something and what the issues are? Or are we all comfortable with that? I mean, I want to get the committee as educated as necessary in order to make a cogent and smart decisions.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, I think the committee made that decision in October when we heard the extensive presentation from the retirement about the need to address this issue. I think everyone shares the concerns of Senator Kinski that these are hard decisions that have to be made, but in order to have a sound retirement system, we have to make them. And that's why these bill drafts are in front of us today. So I think those policy decisions have been made. You know, from my perspective, and so some clarity about my understanding of the two bill drafts. 341 is kind of the simplistic version of how we keep the fund sound, which is requiring additional contributions from employer and employee, whatever that division of responsibility is determined, which in the bill draft is 50-50. 342 is changing our evaluation of the system, relieving us of this obligation to hit a crisis point and needing to make big policy decisions by converting how we determine contributions through an actuarial system. I recall hearing testimony from the retirement system, and I believe this committee already made that decision that that was a pretty prudent and responsible way to go. And it was kind of an automatic increase based on the needs of the fund. So I think there are two choices in front of us. And as Mr. Fuller indicated, they are mutually exclusive. 341, I think, provides that immediate infusion of cash. Its implication with 342 having the 0.5%, 0.5 basis point increase is that softer move that takes us into that actuarial system. So in some ways, 342 in my mind is kind of the softer, gentler approach that allows a greater understanding because its effective date would be 26. I support both efforts, but I think those are the questions, but we've already made, in my mind, the policy decision of the need to do this in October.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call a question on the previous motion.
So,
Mr. Chairman, I didn't know if the committee wanted to entertain the amendment to the appropriation amount for the school foundation program. appropriation on page 7.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fuller, if you wouldn't mind going to page 3 and under Roman 3, I want to make sure that I'm understanding that section correctly. I'm seeing it as two components. The first sentence requiring the employer to pay their share, and the second sentence, the remaining portion being the employee shall pay their share. Am I seeing that accurately?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's correct. And this is unchanged in the bill. So there's no change to the percentage amount that the employer can pick up of the employee's contribution, meaning that as drafted, the employee would be responsible for the additional 0.5% increase that's contemplated in this bill.
So, Mr. Chairman, as we've talked a little bit on the pros and cons of the governor's letter, if the governor's letter was adopted, we wouldn't need to change language here, or would we?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, so 2 points. First, that if the governor's letter number, I believe 10 is adopted, 5 and 5700ths would need to be stricken and 6.07 would need to be inserted. I believe that's what the governor's letter contemplated. The second point is there was discussion about where to do that. Mr. Chairman, I think this bill would probably be the better place to do it since it is an amendment to existing statute, and certainly within the topical matter as well.
And then follow up, but if we chose to deny the governor's letter, this could remain the same.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, no change to C3.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to propose an amendment on page 7. It's line 12 and 13, but the big one, the easiest way to demonstrate it's on line 13, and delete the 7.5 million and insert 6,825,000.
Moving second, any discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
could someone just explain to me exactly what the effect of that is? I'm just not understanding. So right now it says 7.5 million and you would reduce it to 6.8?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What does that do?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to save the state money. I'm kidding. This is the calculation LSO had made for us.
Don, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our initial estimate benefited from WRS, but unfortunately it used the full amount. And when we were working with the Department of Education on the profile, in fact, we identified that about 9% of employee contributions are paid for by other funds, specifically federal funds. So they did not need to be appropriated in this bill from the school foundation program.
Okay, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, that motion carries. Now, is there any further discussion on who pays or any motions?
Chairman.
Trey?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I apologize that I don't have this perfected. I would like for us to consider using the language in the governor's letter 10 in this bill to make adjustments on page 3, lines 30 to 36.
So it's a conceptual amendment
6.07.
to have the state pay the portion of the general fund dollars for the increase. Is that a fair recharacterization?
Yes.
Changes that number from 5.576.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moving second in discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So as I indicated yesterday, I'm no on this amendment for the following reason. The testimony from Mr. Swindell yesterday was that under the current system, for an employee to get $1 worth of additional contribution into the fund, the employee now pays 20 cents. And if we adopt 24 LSO 341 with no amendment, that will go up And so by a half, and so instead of putting in 3.68%, the employee would put in another 50 basis points or 4.18 on a total contribution of 19.62. So the percentage contribution by the employee would then be 21.2%, 21.3. So that would mean that without the amendment, the employee, to get $1 worth of contribution, will have to pay 21.3 cents instead of paying 20 cents. For my own retirement, if I want to get $1 worth of contribution, I have to pay $1, right? I mean, this employee retirement plan is a ripping good deal. It is a great deal. And I don't think it's unduly burdensome to have the employees pay 21.3 cents to get $1 worth of contribution. And I think the testimony from the hearing in, I think, October was that when it comes to paying out benefits, the benefits paid out are far, far greater than the dollars contributed in. And I think it's about, for every dollar you contribute, there's about $3 that gets paid back out roughly. So that means for 21.3 cents of contribution, I ultimately get $3 of benefits back. That is just a ripping good deal. And I don't think it's unreasonable to have the employees pay that extra 1.3 cents. So on and against the amendment.
Representative Sherwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Clark, for that. I think for our younger employees who are coming into the workforce, I don't think that they care about that at all. I think what they care about is the bottom line of what is the amount that is impacted monthly or annually and how much less that they have to spend on housing, gas, food, their children's education. They're thinking about the now and the now of recovering from the impacts of the pandemic and inflation. And so while I do think that, what you said is a really great point, and maybe some of our employees who are closer to retirement are thinking about that. I'm thinking about our younger workforce and those that we're trying to recruit and retain. It's the next generation of our hardworking employees that we want to consider in this move. So I appreciate that feedback, but I guess I would ask the director, or if we have better understanding of what this change would do to someone's average annual salary or monthly salary, and look at it from that perspective. Thank you.
Go ahead, Representative Henderson.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote against this because there's a lot of discussion left to be done among us over the next days. I think the better that we keep this one, the more likelihood of it getting through the process. And at various points, any one of us can bring whatever amendment we like regarding the nuances of the governor's letter or other related matters.
Further discussion?
Did she ask Director Swindell?
Yeah, do you have a response to her question?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherwood, on the memo that's in your package referencing on 341 dated December 8th, there's all this information on the public employee plan. On page 6 of that memo, we note that the average salary in the public employee plan is just under $61,000 a year. And if the bill were to be passed in its current form, without referencing the governor's suggestion on the state employee contribution, the average state employee would pay an additional $25.37 per month at the end with both phases. There's a year 1 phase and year 2 phase, or $304 a year. In this memo on page 6 in the green table at the bottom of the page, sir.
So that's the combined of phase 1 and phase 2.
Correct. You get there in 2 steps with this bill.
Okay. Further discussion? Question on the bill being called? On the amendment. All, I think it was seconded. Any further discussion on the amendment? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No. The motion fails. We're back on the bill.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
just for numbers, and looking at the amount that our property taxes have gone up, on average, in my county, $10.66 a month compared to this $25.37 a month. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question being called on the bill. Roll call.
Members of the Appropriations Committee, the motion is on 24 LSO 0341, working draft 0.6 as amended. Representative Henderson.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood.
No.
Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Representative Juan and Sir Dave.
Aye.
Senator Anderson. Senator Guru. Senator Kinski. Senator Salazar. Co-Chairman Nethercott. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the motion is adopted.
Preference for House or Senate bill? Well, they need. Okay. Okay, let's go to 342.
Mr. Chairman, some of the comments on 342 do reference 341 in terms of we're talking about, I want to make sure everyone understands the plan we're talking about. This is the Wyoming Retirement System Public Employee Plan. It's our largest plan. It has about 34,000 active, almost 35,000 active employees, K through 12 being the largest population. The state having 7,000 employees in this plan. And there's references here in the material about the benefit structure of the retiree population, which is about 31,000 people. The benefit structure, tier 1, tier 2, and so forth. The big picture here is that this plan is not going away. It is on an upward trajectory, but it's really slow with the current contribution rates. If nothing is done, then we project in 2054, the plan is 77% funded now. It's only going to be about 88% funded. It's going to be glacial. And that's costly because until you pay off the unfunded liability of the fund, the rates have to be higher. And we want to get it to a stage where we can drop those amortization rates, and that in the end that saves you a lot of money. There's some comment in the bill on that. The bill you just passed gets us halfway there to where the actuaries say we really need to be in order to pay this off in a reasonable amount of time and start saving money in 20 or 25 years. Right now, we think the contribution rate is 2% behind what it needs to be. It's 18.62. It needs to be about 2% higher. Actually, I think 1.99 by the calculation. The bill you just passed is 100 basis points, so it gets you roughly halfway there. And we would do that if the bill passes both houses and the governor signs it. We would do that in this biennium with the mechanism we just discussed. The policy question then becomes, well, where to from here? How do we close the rest of the gap? And what's the mechanism that the legislature wants to adopt to do that? Many states have found that at some point it is advisable to put this on a more administrative basis with a mechanism that avoids the year or biennial consideration by the legislature, which is usually fraught with politics, usually fraught with delays. We're usually behind the power curve. And like any financial situation, more money now allows us to compound those earnings. I think it was mentioned by Representative Stith that it's true that in a pension system that's properly pre-funded, really only about 30% or 35% of the ultimate benefit is paid for by contributions from anybody, whether that's the employer or the employee. We get the investment markets to pick up about 2/3 of that. But in order to do that, you have to have the investment corpus from the contributions. And that's what this bill, both bills help establish and get us there in a reasonable amount of time. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce Paul Wood. He's got a short presentation that's in your packet. It's a little bit of an update to the ADC mechanism, and it benefits from some research done by GRS, not necessarily at a Paul's office, but I think this came out of the Michigan office. And I think it's worthwhile for about 5 or 6 minutes.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll move through this quickly, and it's number, I'm sorry, I should have known the number offhand in terms of your agenda, but let's see, Dave, do you know that? Yes, that's the one. Perfect. All right, so this is sort of the, maybe we'll just call this the final pitch here for why actuarially determined contribution funding is pretty important. And this analysis is actually done by a colleague of mine actually in Dallas, Joe Newton. And we took a look at all of the public plan data in the NASRA public plan survey and said, how do these plans look when we compare what their funding policies look like to what their current funding status is? And then we took it a step further and said, we've got all these 118 plans or so that we look at. What's going to happen in 10 years and how is this going to play out? And where are the advantages going to come through your funding policy for all of these plans? And so if we, the first couple pages here, pages 2 and 3, you've seen these before, C plus I equals B plus C. I think we all know that pretty well. So we'll move on from there. And we'll move on to slide 5.
Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to slide 2, your very first bullet point.
Yes.
I just want to make the general public that's hearing this or reading this understand that that would only really matter if everyone left the system right this second. Because otherwise it makes it appear that we are in dire straits, and I don't want to scare off our wonderful public employees. So I would like you to make a very clear explanation of when you say this is an unfunded liability, that it is not crisis.
Absolutely.
It is not the world burning down. It is actually where we are on a percentage basis. We're sound and acceptable. So just for the general public, I think that needs to be clarified, and clarified very well for certainty and stability.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair, Representative. So on that slide 2, we state that we have about $2.8 billion in unfunded accrued liability. And so that's the figure we have today. But we have a lot of things working in our favor. We have, as Dave mentioned, we have investment returns that are coming in, and then we have future contributions. And so we rely on those future contributions to pay down this $2.8 billion over a long period of time. This does not need to be paid off today. Would it be fantastic if we were 100% funded? Absolutely, but we're not. And that's why I feel like we're here in this room today, is to talk about how to better improve the funding of our plan and take care of that $2.8 billion over, say, the next 25 to 30 years. And so we're not in crisis mode right now. We're in trying to figure out the best approach to pay off this unfunded accrued liability that we know is there. And we have a vast majority of it is already, we already had that set aside through the 18.62% contributions coming in. And now we're just talking about what is the incremental change to make sure that that amount is paid off over, say, a period of 25 years instead of over a period of 41 years.
So,
And then just to clarify kind of what an unfunded liability is. In the day, what we do is we say, okay, we know the value of the assets of the fund. What are the liabilities of the fund? Well, they are estimated by the actuaries of all the estimated payments going out, and we discount those back to present value to do the comparison. Well, back in the day, if you were 100% funded, we assumed 8% return. If you assume 8%, you discount those liabilities 8%. We got enough money. Financial markets change. The estimate now is we can probably only count on about 6.8% annualized return. So you had enough money. Now, pretty much at the stroke of a pencil, now you don't, just based on lower estimates. That's really what's happened in this pension plan and all pension plans across the United States since the great financial crisis in 2008. So now you say, well, we're going to count on less investment income. So we either have to reduce benefits or we have to increase contributions. In this plan, we've reduced benefits. We've had tier 2 and we haven't paid a COLA. And we've had some increases to contribution rates. And those rates are enough to put the plan, eventually this plan will become fully funded. but it's going to take, like Paul just said, 41 years. And that's a long time to be paying those higher contribution rates. And we'd like to pay it off sooner so that we can get back to a normal cost, which would be around 12% contribution rates instead of today's 18.62 or now higher.
And so,
So that's the situation.
but that is predicated on an average return of 6.8%, right?
Mr. Co-Chairman, that's correct.
And so if, and we're not making that right now, at least on the government side. If it was, if the actual average return over the next 30 years is 5.5%, where would we be?
We provided some analysis for that. I can't recall the exact figures. You'll still on a growth path, but it takes even longer. And so you pay those rates even longer. The other reason you want to pay this off sooner is because it does make the plan more robust in case of adverse investment experience. And that's pretty much what you're looking at. I mean, the other things can affect the plan, but it's really the investment experience. So you want to have some buffer there and get there sooner. It's kind of like we're hanging out in a more dangerous zone and you're passing a truck on the freeway. There's a place you don't really want to hang out. That's kind of where we're at, because if you got a downdraft from here, it's more painful than if you were better funded. So you make a very good point.
Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, please proceed, Paul.
All right, great. Well, thank you. And I will take advantage here of just stopping on slide 3 real quick to do C plus I equals B plus C, because I think everyone's aware just how much I love this particular formula. And it puts that into perspective here of that $2.8 billion. So over the long run, we know we have to pay off those benefits. And we do that through those two different avenues. We do it through contributions and investment earnings. And so the benefits are pretty much more or less, we know what those are going to look like. The investment earning piece is the one that has a lot of volatility. And now we're talking about how do we make sure that that contribution piece is sufficient to make this equation balance over the long run. This equation doesn't need to balance today, doesn't need to balance tomorrow, but over the long run, it needs to balance. We need to have enough contributions and investment earnings to come in to pay those benefit payments plus the expenses. So again, a very powerful formula that I think helps us understand, one of the reasons that we're here talking about this need for additional contributions. We want this formula to balance over the long run. So I will move forward 2 slides to slide 5. And I think we've talked about this a fair amount here, but I think it's good to refresh that we break down these funding policies into 3 different types of funding policies. First, actuarially determined, which is the topic of 342, which we're talking about now. And then we have a statutorily set contribution that does require some change or some action to properly fund the plan or to bring those contributions up to a sufficient level. And then there's that third approach, which is, more or less the set it and forget it method, where we just set that contribution amount and then it doesn't change. And then we rely on, when we go back to our equation, we rely on investment earnings to make up any differences to make that equation balance over the long run. And so on slide 6, this particular analysis, which I find to be really very interesting and enlightening, is that we've taken those 3 different types of funding policies and we've said, let's take a look at the plans that fall under those 3 particular funding policies. And then we broke it down to plans that are following what we would call the best practices in terms of funding. And so that means you have an amortization period that's sufficiently short enough to amortize over a reasonable period of time. You have a really good set of assumptions, this, that, and the other. And then we have the, follows the best practices. And so you can see there's those 6, I don't know what the quadrant equivalent of 6 is, but there's 6 different boxes there. And they show how those plans stack up across the country. And you can see that down in the lower left-hand corner, that's sort of the best set of plans right there. We're 60 plans that are making contributions on an actuarially determined contribution basis and follow all those best practices. And you can see that their average funded ratio is about 81%, and they're expected to be fully funded within 10 years. You go to the exact opposite, the upper right-hand side there, those are the statutorily set contributions, no requirement for any change. There's 18 plans in there, average funded ratio of 68%, but you can see what jumps out there, average about 37 years until you reach fully funded. So this is the box that effectively Wyoming would fall into at this particular moment here. And so you can see that, as you move across that diagonal there, you got your best practices, actuarially determined contribution, and then your practices that your contribution rates are not sufficient to cover an actuarially determined contribution, and they also don't automatically change, you can see that you get, some poor outcomes. But then taking the analysis a step further, which I think is the really exciting part, and that's on slide 7, is let's take a look at these plans 10 years into the future and just allow their funding policies to work their way through there. And we can see what happens with our different boxes here. We again go back to that lower right-hand corner or lower left-hand corner. Those are our best plans, 95% funded, expected to be fully funded within 2 years. So pretty fantastic. But then we go back up to that upper right-hand box there, those 18 plans. They've only improved their funded ratio about 10% and still 27 years from being fully funded. So it's just another great example of why this automatic mechanism, this actuarially determined contribution mechanism, is going to put us on a better path and really set ourselves up for that really successful outcome. Then on slide 8, this just aggregates some of that information, but we also added in what would happen if there was a 10% loss in our investments, and what kind of shock that would have on those plans. And as you would imagine, the actuarially determined contribution plans, they're going to come out looking just fine. They're going to be still 88% funded in 10 years, 6 years from being fully funded. But then we look at that bottom box there, 66% funded, so actually projected to be worse funded than we are today. And then that time to fully funded is actually longer, so 44 years. And so again, just another great example. And this is just looking at all the data across the country, aggregated together to come up with this analysis to show you that you really want to have yourself in the best position for success, then go ahead and get that actuarially determined contribution funding in there. And then just to wrap up on slide 9, we're currently at 77%. We're expected to hang around 77% for the next 10 years or so. Again, that 41-year funding period, so still a pretty long time. And if the WRS did have a negative 10% return, then it would take a very, very, very long time for that plan to recover and to become fully funded. And it may not happen in my lifetime. And again, that funded ratio, it only tells us part of the story. It's really about, what is that funding policy and what have we been talking about for months and months here and making tremendous progress on this.
Let's go back to point number 2. We're almost guaranteed we're going to have a 10% correction in the next 10 years and maybe 2 of them in the next 3 years. Mm-hmm. So if you take that into consideration, we'll never get there in our lifetime. Correct.
And when we show these sorts of analysis, it's a negative 10% stress test, and we don't assume any sort of recovery. So there's no wishful thinking after a bad outcome. But a lot of times we see, the expectation is still 6.8 over the long run. And so if we do see a negative 10% event, it would follow that we may see a positive 25% event to offset some of that. And so this is just to give you a sense of, if there was no recovery, if we entered a new normal, everything dropped by 10% tomorrow, and there was nothing new, no recovery after that, then we could be in a perilous situation.
And to your point, Mr. Co-Chair, I mean, in 2022, we came pretty close to a negative 10, had negative 7. And this year we're up 13. There has been a recovery, but it doesn't, that 1 year of 13 doesn't recover for the difference between expectation of positive 6.8 and negative 7. That's 13.8% off the plan. And so this year gets you, 6% above the plan. We need another recovery year like this to really recover from that 7% loss. So you're exactly right as to how that works.
In our recovery, well exceeded almost all of the professional calculations on how quickly it happened. Go ahead, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those lines, my assumption is that your analysis over this period of time is at 0 cost of living adjustments. So my question is, what is the cost to plan beneficiaries if we do nothing versus what is the cost to plan beneficiaries if we do something too late?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, if we do nothing, that means 341 doesn't pass the floor, and we don't pass 342. We keep contributions the way they are. Then The plan will eventually become fully funded, but you're looking at, maybe 41 years. And statutes are such that we cannot recommend a cost of living adjustment for beneficiaries until the plan is fully funded, plus the amount to pay for the benefit, plus a buffer for market experience. So there'll never be a COLA, and there's no chance of it.
Mr. Chairman,
Go
let
ahead.
me to clarify a little bit. So what I'm saying is that we must do something. And whether it's one or the other of the ADC or the 341, it's going to cost a lot more. And these events are going to be a lot closer than we predict they are now, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I would agree with that.
Okay, please proceed.
All right, thank you. So moving on to slide 11, we just had a quick analysis on the bills that are being put out here. We already talked about 341, the 1% of pay increase over the 2-year period. So we can move to slide number 12 here, where we have the summary of 342. And we can just walk through this quickly. The rates adjust once every 2 years on the even number of years. The first valuation that will be setting those contribution rates will be the January 1, 2025 valuation. So the valuation will perform this time next year. By April 25th, 2025, we'll report our actuarially determined contribution to all the state agencies and then put into the budget process sometime in late 2025. The new rates, again, effective July 1, 2026, and they'll stay effective for 2 years. And then we'll go through a similar process. And then at that point, the rates can't increase by more than 50 basis points, plus or minus from the prior biennium. And then I think a couple of nice protections that are in here is that the rates can never go below normal cost. And so once we hit that fully funded point, there will not be an opportunity for us to effectively take a credit if we're overfunded and fund a level that's lower than normal cost. So we'll stay above 100% funded, which I think is where we want to be. And then also those rates can't reduce unless we've reached a 90% funding goal.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I remember the discussion, but I've forgotten detail of why we would put that goal. It has to be at 90% before anything could be reduced versus 100, or why, what's the overall purpose of having that in place?
Mr. Chair, Representative Walters, the reason for that is that if we get into a situation where we're making really good progress and then we have a pretty decent year in the markets and that rate is saying we could come down a little bit, it could slow down our progress a little bit. And so that the goal is to keep that rate up at the level that it's at so that we maintain that momentum and then we don't slow down our drive towards that fully funded point.
Another way to say is don't harvest your crop until it's really ready to be harvested.
Mr. Chairman, totally understand, but why do we put this 90? You can start to harvest your crop at 90% instead of 100%. That's the question.
Okay. Part of the reason for that is, when you get to this point, when you start to see some of these graphs of how that contribution could change over time, as you start to approach 100% funded, you're going to see a pretty large drop in your contribution rate. And so this just provides a little bit of maybe a parachute to get down to that point. Instead of having everything drop as soon as you hit 100%, it says, okay, we're approaching 100%. Now let's try to get on a glide path to a lower contribution rate. And that's going to affect things such as, liquidity requirements, your investments, some of that. When that contribution rate drops down significantly, you're going to be in a very different situation in terms of cash flows coming in and out of the plan. And so there's going to be, needs to address some of that. And this is just a 90% target is a good place to start thinking about that glide path to a more reasonably lower contribution.
Having said that, Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, I'd say if the committee wanted to make that 100%, I don't think there's an issue with that.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's the first time that we've seen this 90% concept.
Yeah, that's when that would be the minimum, is when you could start reducing rates. You're still going to move to 100% funded, but it's, when do you think that we're getting close enough we can start ratcheting down the contribution rate and glide into it a little bit? That's what that's referring to. And it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, we're not going to do that until we hit 100%.
Brian, mark out that language because we're going to want to address that. Go ahead.
Thank you. And then finally, the rates are split more or less evenly between the employee and the employer. Again, as Dave mentioned earlier, 49.68% and 50.32% employee-employer split in terms of these rates. So we did do a little analysis to show you some of the differences between the two bills, and then looked at the combination scenario where we increase the rate by the 1% and then get on the ADC path. And so that's on slide 13, or the scenarios that we modeled. Slide 14 shows the projected funded ratios. And this again assumes that we have a 6.8% return in all years. So it's our expectation. You can see that, even under the baseline, the plan is not predicted to lose any ground in terms of funding. It just doesn't move very quickly. And this is something that Dave has talked about a lot, speed and trajectory. It's just pretty slow. Moving to the 1% increase, that orange line there in the middle, you can see we improve a little bit. So an additional 1% of pay contribution is going to shift that line up to some extent. And then the yellow line, and there's a gray line underneath it because the combination and the ADC policy are very similar. You can see it's going to put us right on path to reach that fully funded point by about 2048, which is the underlying expectation of the ADC plan that's in place right now. Slide 15 just shows you some of the contribution rates that will be necessary. So the contribution rates could go up to potentially 22%, but this doesn't take into consideration the solid investment year we had this year, and then we still have to see what happens in 24 and 25, and that will inform some of this. But the other item I just wanted to show on 16 is, let's look at what a stress event. Let's see that 0% return in 1 year with no recovery whatsoever. Our funded ratio under the baseline, it really shows that this does not react. And it goes back to that slide that I had with the 6 different boxes. If we do have that stress event, these fixed rate plans that don't automatically adjust, they're not going to recover quite as quickly. And you can see the blue line just sits at 70% for the next 30 years. Whereas with the 1% increase, that's in 341, there's still a little bit of an upturn there, but still only hitting 80% within 30 years. And then the ADC piece puts us right back on track to be fully funded, which is where we want to be. But again, going back to our fun equation, C plus I equals B plus C, if we lose out on some of that I, it does have to be made up on the contribution side. And so you can see on slide 17 that those contribution rates would be expected to tick up to some extent to make up for that loss in the investment return. On slide 18, we always focus on the bad. Let's take a look at what happens if we have a nice outcome here. So instead of a 0% return, we have a 13.6% return. And you can see that the baseline, it actually does fairly well. And so it does tell us that, again, the 18.62 that we're at right now, it's not going to be the death of this plan. And if we do have some positive experience, we can get right back on track. But the ADC policy, again, is going to put us on that guaranteed path. And then you'll notice that at the tail end of this graph, that yellow line there, it starts to just level off at 100%. And so the beauty of that then is shown on the next slide, on slide 19. And that's where you can see that the rates start to decrease. So we hit about 90% in this scenario under 2038, starts to grade down. And then by 2048, that contribution rate drops down pretty significantly. And so what's nice about the ADC plan is it gives us an idea of when that contribution rate is going to be able to drop. And then that's going to free up money in the budget, I believe, at that point to be able to use possibly towards cost of living adjustments, or again, put some certainty into when those cost of living adjustments may be paid. As to where it is right now, as Dave said, you have to be 100%, 107% funded, and that may never happen under the current arrangement. But at least under an ADC policy, we have a goal in mind, we have a target, and we know that the contributions will decrease significantly in the future. So finally, on slide 20, just to wrap up here, the current policy, we do know that we are going to need additional contributions at some point, especially in the face of the stress event. The 1% to pay is a really great first step, and so I commend the committee for taking that first step. And the ADC policy will put us on track to be fully funded by 2048. And then that combination approach, so taking the 1% step and then moving to the ADC, is going to really smooth out that transition to the actuarially determined contribution. And, again, put us on a very solid path for, we hope to be a very successful outcome for the state of Wyoming.
Okay, questions for Paul? Representative Swanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure if it's for Paul or for the director, but do you guys keep track of the average age of the people in each pension plan? And I was trying to find it in this, but I don't know. It's just a curiosity question. So, I mean, I'm trying to decide, where the majority of the folks are, if they're on the end ready to retire, or if we have a lot of young folks that are going to be able to support the ones that are retiring.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Zwanzer, in the public employee plan, the average age of active members is 45.78 years. It's not in the paper. It's on my cheat sheet that I carry with me.
Mr. Chairman.
Follow-up? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Is it possible? So you have the average age for all the pension plans? Is that something that you could just email us for fun?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I can email that to you. This is a PDF. I call it the horse blanket. The GRS produces this. Each column is each plan, and I can give you this one today, and I'll email it to the rest of the committee and print another one.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Anderson.
on your last slide, you said it's on track to be fully funded by 2048. Is that 100% or is that 90% that we're talking about now?
Mr. Chair, Senator, that would be under the ADC policy, that would be the 100% funded. 2048 is the target.
Well, go ahead, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to have sort of a comparison to think about. And it kind of goes back to what I asked yesterday regarding, what economic benefit do our retirees and, both, active working now and, currently retired. What economic benefit do they bring to the state of Wyoming versus what would it cost for say a 25 basis point or a 50 basis point cost of living adjustment for the funds versus what's the economic benefit of the most positive action that we could do relative to these two bills? Is that too much to ask?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I'll try. A 1% cost of living increase, roughly, costs about $7 to $8 million to do it as a one-time thing, but about 10 times that amount to keep it ongoing. In other words, if we increase your benefit from $100 to $101, we're going to keep that for the rest of the beneficiary's lifespan. You're looking at about $80 million. The increase in the payout of the fund would be, 1%. We pay out in benefits $780 million last year. So a 1% COLA on top of that. It's 1% of 780 million. 7.8 million, but it goes out every year. And in the end, you wind up with the 70 million that it would cost to fully fund that up front. We'll pay out twice that in benefits, about 140 million, because we would take that sum and we would invest it. So that'd be the benefit to the beneficiaries, and 78% of the money we pay out stays in Wyoming.
Bring it home, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, bring it home. Question, follow up.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So my estimate is our GDP is around 45 billion. My estimate is that based on information that I've been given from the retirement system, that of that 780 million, about 80% stays right here at home, working for us. And that translates into about, what is that? 560? Which if you use the multiplier effect, could translate into about 2 to 3, maybe more billion per year economic benefit. Is that about right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I would agree with that. Yeah, retirees will spend their money. The benefit goes out to support retirees, but of course it goes to Main Street.
Okay, any further questions to Paul? So any public comment on the bill? Any public comment on the bill? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Bill moved by Representative Larson, seconded by Co-Chairman Nethercott. Discussion.
So, oh,
Do you
Mr.
want to walk
Chairman,
through the bill?
would you like me to walk through the bill? Yeah, that'd be my question.
That's a good idea.
Well,
okay. Why?
All right, so
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, 24 LSO 342, you should have .6. This is 49-02 in the meeting materials. The retirement system is kind of given a general.
Right. So it's 10:30. Do we want to take a short break before we walk through? We want to keep going? All right. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The retirement system is given a general overview of the bill. I'll just walk through it quickly. So over the course of a fiscal biennium, on January 1 of an odd number year, the retirement system is required to calculate the actuarially determined contribution rate. I'm on page 2, line 17. This is in a new section of statute within the Wyoming Retirement Act that would go right after the member and employer contribution statutes. So January 1, 25, and then each January 1 of the odd numbered year, the retirement system would calculate the actually determined contribution rate using the balance of the account, the value of benefits, estimated expenses, and officially adopted assumptions. The retirement system would use this valuation to calculate the actually determined contribution rate for the next fiscal biennium. Then on page 3, line 5, by April 15th of each odd numbered year, the retirement system must report that ADC rate to each participant of the plan, the governor, the state auditor, state budget department, and this committee. The staff comment on page 3 is just a consideration for the committee whether notice should be given to each employee under the plan, as well as an opportunity to comment on that rate. Sample language for doing that is on page 3, line 22. Then on page 4, line 1, this just requires the retirement system to calculate an updated ADC rate on each even numbered year. This is really just for informational purposes. It would not be used as the rate that employers and employees would pay. Then on page 4, line.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do this in 2 locations, page 2, line 19, and again here on page 4, line 5. You're using the market value. Would it not be better to use the actuarial value so that you get a smoothed amount versus a jumping all around amount?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that is a suggestion the retirement system has made in its memo that was provided to the committee. I believe the reference was to a 5-year rolling average, and if that is the preferred method of calculation, that would be a consideration for the committee to include that as well, that 5-year average in that language. But Mr. Chairman, those are recommendations from the retirement system.
Follow up.
Paul, do you want to comment on that? Looks like you may want to.
Mr. Chair, just real quick, I would not use rolling average. I think actuarial value of assets would encompass, it's a little more intricate than just a rolling average. So I wouldn't use that language if I had to make a suggestion.
Go ahead.
Then, Mr. Chairman, page 4, line 14. So after the ADC rate is calculated in the odd number years, the state budget department and the retirement system would calculate necessary amounts for budgeting purposes to account for any increased, or for that matter, decreased employer contributions. And then those would be reflected in the budget process. The staff comment on page 5, line 10, is another consideration for the committee, whether the committee should consider whether the legislature should play a more active role in expressly approving or disapproving the ADC rate that's calculated. This would be similar to the process for changes to judges' salaries that the legislature utilized in the last budget. Sample language for doing so is on page 5, line 17. If it's approved by the legislature, or if the legislature is silent, then the ADC rate would be adopted. If it's disapproved, then the ADC rate would be unchanged for that next fiscal biennium. Then page 5, line 37. Any change in the ADC rate would take effect on July 1 of the subsequent even numbered year. And then any change in the rate, these are, Mr. Chairman, what I'd call kind of the side rails or guardrails. Any change in the ADC rate must be in accordance with the following. So first, page 6, line 8. This is the language that would limit the increases to 0.5% and the decreases from 0.5%. Page 6, line 21, the ADC rate cannot be decreased if the plan has a funded ratio of less than 90%. So, Mr. Chairman, the top of page 7, if the committee desires, would be where 90% would need to be amended to 100%. The retirement system also had a suggested language change to after 90% or 100, depending on the committee's will, to insert on both a market and actuarial basis. Then the staff comment on page 7. The first staff comment is language for specifying the amortization period. And this would be consistent with the retirement system's recommendation that they made in their memorandum.
So where did that staff language come from?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, that came from the retirement system. On page 7, line 11, you mean?
So I think we need to get an explanation of what it means, because you're using a closed amortization period of 30 years with an adjustment created over a year-to-year experience over 20 years. What does that mean?
Mr. Chair, so this is the policy that's currently in place in the valuation reports that are issued currently. So this is what we call the board's policy. And effectively what is going on is we look back to the 2018 valuation, and we had an unfunded accrued liability at that time. And the plan was to pay that unfunded accrued liability off over a 30-year period. So that's where we get the 2048 date. Subsequent to that, we know that there's going to be what we call actuarial gains and losses each and every year. So we'll have good years and we'll have bad years. And those good years and bad years are then set aside on their own and amortized over their own 20-year amortization period. The thought is that those good and bad years over time will offset, and that we have a smooth contribution. And so we don't have these big swings year to year. And especially when we get down towards, say, the last 10 years of that 30-year amortization period, if we had a really bad year with 10 years to go, that contribution rate could spike up tremendously. But instead we say, let's set up a new layer and amortize that over a 20-year period. And this happens to be, this layering approach is one of the best practices there's a white paper from the Conference of Consulting Actuaries on funding policies, and they recommend to use this layering approach to cut down on that volatility, especially at the tail end of an amortization period. So it's a standard mechanism that's used in public sector pension funding.
So the way it's crafted, it could go both ways. Right?
In terms of,
in other words, if you had high years.
Yeah. Yep. So
then you decrease faster.
Yep. So the whole point is that, we can only do the valuation once a year. And so one year we may have something that's good. The next year it's going to be offset by something that may not be as good. And then as you ladder that over time, And you can see in the valuation report, I wish I had a copy with me, but we have this history of these gains and losses to show you how this amortization approach plays out over time. And I always like to refer to it as like rings on a tree because it really helps you see, okay, so in 2018, that's our initial amount. 2019, we had a gain. So what happened in that year that led to that gain? The next year, we may have had a loss. What led to that particular loss? We have this very defined schedule that's going to show you, you can look at this piece of paper and say, here's the plan for paying off every single dollar of unfunded accrued liability that we have as of this particular valuation date. Here it's laid out right in this plan right here, and you can see it. It's very transparent. And then it also takes that step further to deal with future gains and losses that may materialize over time.
And Mr. Chairman, basically the funding policy says, well, if you have an unfunded liability, how fast are we going to catch up on it? I mean, you could say, we'll catch it up in 1 year, but then you have huge swings in the rates. Right? 20 years is about right because that keeps the payments kind of smooth. We don't get too excited about things. And it also addresses intergenerational equity. You could say, well, we'll amortize it over 40 years. We'll basically kick the can and make it somebody else's problem. And so 20 years or right around there is a recommended average. The reason that the board did the 30-year on the legacy debt as of 1 January 2018 was simply for affordability. A 30-year mortgage is cheaper than a 20-year mortgage. The other comment is you don't have to specify the funding policy. The board sets that and you be comfortable with it. That's the status quo. But if you're going, the thinking is if you're going to adopt an ADC mechanism, your funding policy impacts that ADC calculation because if you developed an unfunded liability, how fast are we going to pay it off? And so the legislature may want to specify it. You don't have to. When Rhode Island went this way, they did specify it in statute. But you don't have to do it. You could just let the board continue to do it. And I don't think the board's going to change their funding policy. This is not like the assumed rate of return. It's more of a policy decision, so it's more stable. It's up to the committee.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Director Swindell, and you've probably got it in one of your charts that I didn't understand. If you do it as a 30-year mortgage, how does that affect this graph that you have here? In other words, I'm assuming that this one with the gray with the actually determined contributions was over the 20 years or so, 25. Or does it affect this graph at all? Am I completely misunderstanding?
Mr. Chair.
How much rate relief do you get if you stretch it out to 30 years?
Right. So in that particular graph there, that's using this funding policy at 30 years from 2018. And so if we were to reset the amortization period today, so say starting with a 24 valuation, we'd add an additional 6 years of those high payments onto the back end of the amortization. So it would probably increase the rate, maybe by 0.5% or 1%, or I'm sorry, it would lower the rate a little bit, but you'd be paying that higher rate for 6 years longer.
Mr. Chairman, so
So
you get a half point savings on the rate then, but you pay for 6 more years?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the ADC rate, instead of being a 1.99% short, might be only 1.49% short. But you're going to be paying those higher rates for about 6 years longer than if you went with the current funding policy. That's an illustration of how the funding policy can affect this a little bit.
Okay, go ahead. Ron.
Yep, then Mr. Chairman, page 7, line 21, this is the language that provides that the ADC rate cannot be less than the normal cost rate and then provides a basic definition of that. The staff comment beginning on the bottom of page 7 is more recommendations from the retirement system. So first, adding a reference to administrative expenses. And then second, defining the normal cost contribution as it's expressed in the retirement system's actuarial reports. That language appears on page 8, line 4. I would note that the definition of normal cost contribution is quite specific and detailed for that statute. Then page 8, beginning on line 26, this is the division of payments of the ADC rate by employer and employee. This approximates the status quo today. So the division between the employer and the employee that was already discussed, the 49.68 for the members, 50.32 for the employer. The member contribution is reflected on page 8, line 30. Then on page 9, line 4 is the employer. the 50.32. Page 9, line 11 keeps the existing 5.57% state employer pickup of the employee portion. So bottom line, the intent here is to keep the status quo between what the employer pays and what the employee pays. Beginning on page 9, line 21 are conforming amendments. These are almost exclusively statutory references. The changes in 93412 that are on page 13 strike the obsolete language similar to 341 and then adds a reference to the ADC amount. Mr. Chairman, the one thing I would note about this change and then the change to 93413 is that there may need to be some finessing if both of these pass to make sure they're accurately reflected. And then, Mr. Chairman, the final thing I would note with the conforming amendments is that there are 2 corrections that I would need to make, and I'm happy to outline those. They're what I would deem technical corrections to delete some of the references that are made here and then to correct one statutory reference. I'm happy to give those if the committee wants to adopt them formally, or I can make those as going through the bill.
I think we can do it as we go through the bill. Yeah, just do them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's one repeal that repeals the paragraph, the existing paragraph that provides for the employer payment of the employee contribution, and that was just moved to the new section. With that, Mr. Chairman, I stand for questions.
Questions? Seeing everyone has questions.
I have some amendments,
Okay.
if you're ready for those.
Any? We moved the bill. Yeah.
We can do it
You
again.
seconded it. Yeah, you seconded it. Yeah.
Backwards in JAC.
Whoops.
Yes,
Let's do it again.
amendments.
Let's
Do
have a
amend-
motion to move the bill. Move the bill.
Second.
No, it doesn't.
Move and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, that motion carries. Okay, discussion on the bill. Any amendments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple amendments. Mr. Chairman, I'd start on page 2, line 19. Where it says market value, I would replace that with actuarial value. I would do the same thing on page 4, line 5, where it says market value, I would replace it with actuarial value.
It's moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I would move on to page 6, bottom of page 6, top of page 7. The 90%, I would like to increase that to 99% and insert the language based on market and actuarial value following the percentage.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed? Let's see a show of hands. All those in favor? raise your
Mr.
hand.
Chairman, before we do the vote, can I make an explanation?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks. So I set it at 99 instead of 100, recognizing the need for there to be somewhat of a slowing right as we get up near full funding of this. If we go to the full funding and then all of a sudden there's a cliff essentially that creates wonkiness in cash flow and everything else. And so by setting it at 99, all it says, and that doesn't require them to reduce rates at 99%. It just says they cannot reduce rates until it hits 99%. And this allows the board a little bit of flexibility, as I would describe it, sliding into home plate, how they're going to make sure that's not a headfirst dive, but rather a graceful slide. And so I recognize we'd all like to say it's 100%, but I think this allows some functionality for the board to meet the needs as they come into 100% fully
So
funded.
that does raise a couple questions. And so, Paul, I'd like you to go back to like your page 17 and 19, where you have that, what appears to be a significant drop in the contributions after 30 years. My understanding is in reality, that doesn't happen because you have up and down events throughout that 30th year period. And as we get closer to the last 10 years, all it takes is one major inflection, and that whole line just goes out another 5 years or 10 years, predicated on the current actuarial values. So in that sense, the graph is a bit deceiving, or I think disproportionate on what really is going to happen.
Mr. Chair, this mechanism or this outcome here is we commonly refer to it as the cliff. And we've done a lot of modeling on this, and that cliff is going to exist to some extent one way or the other. If we do have bad experience towards that tail end, what's going to happen is that whole line is going to be shifted up. When we go back to that amortization policy where we had that 2018 amount paid off over a 30-year period, that's fully going to be paid off at 2048. So the rate will drop one way or another at that point. Whether it drops from 24 to 10 or from 26 to 12, that'll be the difference, but there is going to be a significant drop in the contribution requirement at that time because of that set amortization schedule that's employed as part of the policy.
And so, but our current statute says you cannot give a COLA until what, 105%?
107.
107%. And so ideally, if and when that point happens, then some type of COLA could be available versus, and if you start giving a COLA, you're not going to be able to drop rates.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would just note too that the bill says on page 6, line 8, decreases are also limited to 0.5% as well.
Chairman?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would just pose the question to any of the folks that voted in our early vote, voted against this idea of 99%, trying to understand why they're against some sort of an opportunity for the board to have a glide path right at the very end versus the 100%. And I could easily be persuaded possibly, but would like to understand, as I stated, this is just to create a glide path right at the very, very, very end.
Why was 90% originally put in the bill?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Othercott, that was the figure I think that was provided from the materials in October that set that 90% as part of, I believe, scenario 3 that was presented to the committee.
And that was based on scenario 3, which the committee asked LSO to put into the bill draft.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Othercott, correct.
And can WRS remind us about scenario 3 and why we picked 90%?
So I don't think that we're fully tied, Mr. Chair, Madam Chairperson. I don't think we're fully tied to the 90%, but what the 90% at least does is it gets us on a better path. You know, we're sitting at 77% funded. If we had put that at 80%, then we only improve, 0.3. If we put it at 90% funded, it's a pretty darn good funded ratio. And it could be a point where we could start to examine or look at some of these strategies to lower the contribution, but not until we get significantly close to being 100% funded.
Are there any funds that are 100% funded?
Yeah, there are quite a few funds that are 100% funded. Most of the ones that we work with are sitting in the same neighborhood that you're at, the 70 to 80% funding. You look at, we've talked about Rhode Island a lot. Rhode Island's making a lot of progress, and they're going to be 100% funded by 2034, somewhere in that neighborhood. And the plans that are at 100% right now, a lot of them, Arizona has a plan. Their healthcare subsidy plan is at 130% funded, so they're doing very well. And so they effectively have an offset to their contribution rate for that particular plan. And so there are plans that are out there that are at that 100% point. And again, I don't think Dave and I, or either of us, are really married to that 90% point. It was just a good starting point for us to begin a discussion and to put that concept out there of let's not lower that rate until we meet some sort of benchmark and we've made some sort of progress. And if it's 100%, if it's 99%, it's at least we're making that step, and we're not going to pull back. And I think as as Dave said earlier, harvest those crops earlier, that we're gonna keep moving forward and keep trying to make that progress and not slow it down at all because we've had a good year or a bad year. I just wanted to offer one more thought because I was sitting here thinking about it, going back to, why we want this particular 90% funded piece in here is we only get one bite of the apple every 2 years as well. And so we don't, if we happen to, let's say that all of our odd years are bad years and all of our even years are really good years, then we'd be making all of our decisions based upon these really good years, and we might be missing something in between there. And so this just adds another level of protection because we only have that chance to change that rate once every 2 years.
So go to your page 14. You're at a 90% in 2040, and yet you don't get to 100% until 2050. So that's essentially, you would then recommend a 10-year glide path.
Yeah, and if you
to slow down that trajectory?
Correct. At that point, if the actuarially determined contribution rate came down as being less, then we could begin that process of grading down back to something that's a little bit lower once you reach that point.
So then, but then, it would just take you another 10 or 15 years to get to 100%.
Correct. Yeah, but the plan is, the goal, at least from the board's perspective on their funding policy, the way it's written right now, is that 2048 date. That's the special date. That's what we're looking for. If we can get there earlier, great. But if it does slow down a little bit in those last 5 years, the goal is still to achieve 100% by 2048. And if we wanted to go sooner, then the policy would have to be changed. But the policy is going to kind of always put us back on track to reach that 2048 date. That's how it's designed.
So, Mr. Co-Chair, to summarize, 90% is just a guardrail in this legislation to don't start cutting rates too soon. And if you want to make that 100%, that's fine. 99%, that's also fine. It's useful to have some sort of guidance there, though, that says don't start cutting rates too soon, even though you can see, oh, I'm almost going to get to 100%, so I can start reducing rates now. You don't want to do that too soon.
So I see it just as the opposite. This language suggests that you need to start cutting at 90%. You need to consider it.
Mr. Chair, that's only the case if the rate comes back as being lower. And so, yeah, if you have a really good year, then potentially you could see that happen. But in a bad year, it would go the other direction. So.
Mr. Co-Chair, I support Representative Walters' motion, 99%. Let's go back and redo that vote.
Okay, further discussion.
Circle the drain.
So back, want to restate the amendment, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The motion for the amendment is on top of page 7, line 1, to change that 90% to 99. And insert the language that says based on market and actuarial basis.
Is there a second? Moved and seconded. Further discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries.
Mr. Chairman,
Please,
I'd offer another amendment,
please.
and that is to insert the language that is shown in the staff comment lines 11 through 16.
What page?
Page 7, excuse me, page 7, staff comment lines 11 through 16. And
Second.
Now that I've received a second, Mr. Chairman, the reason I would do this is this will allow this to match up with what the current board policy is. And the way I see it is it creates a starting point for all of this to go into effect. And since they already have started that, then all of it really plays out simpler if we'll match up what's already going on in the retirement system.
Is that accurate?
It is, yes.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, that's accurate. This is the current board's policy. And so if that's put into statute, you've adopted the current board's policy and the board support that.
Okay.
Question on
Moved
the
and
amendment?
second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Mr. Chairman, one final amendment.
That motion passes.
Oh. And my final amendment, Mr. Chairman, would be page 7, start on page 7, deleting the lines 21 through 26, but adding them right back using the language on page 8, lines 4 through 16.
Moved and seconded. Does everyone understand the motion? All those in favor say aye. Those opposed? That motion carried. Any other amendments? Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, I'd move to incorporate the language relative to notice and comment, opportunity to comment, line 22 to 27, the staff note.
So there's, I guess, discussion. I don't think this language is necessary because retirement is going to be all over this. And when you sign up as a new state employee, you're going to getting notice of what the retirement system is and how it does and how it works and how it's actuarially calculated. And it'll be in your quarterly newsletter. I mean, I just don't think we need to put it in statute, but that's, would you agree or disagree?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Director.
Sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the system, I'm agnostic on this thing. If you want us to notify each employee, we can. I tend to agree that we pretty much do that anyway through the mechanisms that you cited. But we're okay with the staff comment if that's a policy decision for the committee.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would just allude this to that friendly reminder we get from the assessor about how our property taxes are going to go up. And so then we're noticed and we can plan for that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Any other comments on the motion? Representative Henderson.
I think it wouldn't surprise you that I agree with you. I also agree that we don't know the future. And there is a lot of good information comes every paycheck, every period, right? But I think what's key on this is that it provides the feedback mechanism in terms of the employee having the opportunity to comment. They have that now, but they have to send a special letter. That's the only thing.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion say aye. All those opposed? No. That motion fails. Any other motion? Any other discussion on the bill? Okay, Don, roll call.
The motion is on 24 LSO 0342, working draft 0.6 as amended. Representative Henderson.
Aye.
Representative Larson. Representative Sherwood. Representative Stiff.
Aye.
Representative Walters. Representative Swanitzer Dave.
Aye.
Senator Anderson. Senator Guru. Senator Kinski. Senator Salazar. Madam Co-Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the motion has been adopted.
Wow. Now, do you want to take a 5-minute break? No. No.
I have to leave at 11:30 for a minute.
Okay. What's next on our agenda?
Calling back Energy Authority. Energy Authority callback.
Okay. We'll take a 5-minute break. Okay, welcome back. We've got a few callbacks to go through. So, Mr. Krieger, any questions for Mr. Krieger? Or did you have a specific answer?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make sure it was in relation to the energy matching funds and how we administer that. That was the reason for the callback.
Okay, please proceed.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to.
Let's just clarify. Don, go ahead.
Apologies, Mr. Chairman. The requester for this callback is not present. It came from Representative Walters, and I believe the inquiry was background on the approved, pending, and denied applications under the Energy Matching Grant Program.
Okay, MR, which we talked about yesterday, which you've probably heard us talk. Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I did, and I can, just to not go back over yesterday's conversation, I think something that would be important for you all to understand is the process in which we look at applications and the time frame and those sort of things. So when I first started, this fund was still getting started on how to implement when I first took this role back in May. So we put parameters around it that really line up with how DOE implements their grants, so industry had a familiarity with how this would go. So what we do is we have a concept paper. It's very high level, goes through some of the absolutes that we need, but they send that to us and that can be submitted at any time. So Mr. Chairman, if you had a project that you wanted and you submitted today, we would start to look at that next quarter. So January 2 is when we close that last round, and we use these in batches, understanding the limited capacity we have in the office to do these reviews. So as that goes, if the project is up to the standards that we have set in the concept paper, then we move to a full proposal. And my staff works with the industry or the business to basically dot the I's, cross the T's, get more in depth into the detail of the proposal. And at that stage, we take those to a review committee. That review committee consists of myself, the governor's office, the School of Energy Resources, the Business Council, and Department of Workforce Services to bring the different perspectives around these projects to see what impacts on the community they might have, SCR's perspective on the technical side, is this, viable, those sort of things. At that point, Mr. Chairman, since these funds are housed in the governor's office, we provide a recommendation to him on what we think should happen with the funding. And that is the stage that you heard Chief of Staff Perkins mention yesterday, that we will be announcing the second round on Tuesday, the approval or denial. So the reason I lay out the quarterly timeframe for you all is because during yesterday's discussion, it dawned on me that the potential for an amendment that you all may be looking at, I just want you all to be aware that should you do that, our next round will deploy some money in March, assuming that the projects we have in front of us, we have 152 million in applications. We will not fund the whole 152, but understanding it'll be something within there, that'll be issued in March. Then we will start the next round, which would be issued in the end of June or early July. So if this wasn't effective immediately, the amendment you all are contemplating, we would have 2 more rounds per se. So the balance of the account could be much lower than it is today. So I just wanted to make sure the committee was aware of that process. Another thing, I know Chief of Staff Perkins touched on this yesterday. If we do in kind, we don't have a dog in that fight. I would just ask of the committee to understand that that is going to take quite a bit of extra review from our side. If someone claims they get paid $500,000 a year for 4 years and that's their $2 million in kind, where are we to make that decision on what a company pays an employee? If it's equipment and if it's very new technology, that is where we would have to probably contract someone out to look at that and appraise it, give us an accurate estimate. So just to be aware on that, but that's based on yesterday's discussion, what I thought would be most valuable to you all as you look at making this potential amendment.
Go ahead.
So Rob, 2 questions. The first one was in the governor's letter where he talked about having the language to include critical minerals, and we asked at that time if that would be appropriate to maybe put that in that section D where lithium was, and he says, well, let's work that out. So my question is do you feel that that would be the appropriate place, and is that language here, or do you have language that you could maybe provide us?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson,
understanding the intent of the 10 million for lithium, I think it could go there as well as, because that says up to 10 million. Say we get a cobalt project that's 12 million, just to not hamstring us there. I recommend maybe putting it at both if you want it. If you want to continue to have 10 million just for lithium, then I would just do the overarching section to put the list. My recommendation for that would be to include, and I sent this to you all, it's the list, DOE's list of critical materials. That encompasses much more than we think we have here in the state of Wyoming, but it's in my opinion, really a no harm, no foul sort of thing. We could look at cobalt, nickel, those sort of things that are in that list.
My follow-up, Mr. Chairman, is yesterday we got really into the details on specific potential requests. When we talk about the in-kind, we were using names of the applicants. We were using a little out of what I would say is the normal procedure and I had concerns that then it might give the appearance that we were directing you that indeed this is what we expect, when on the other hand, we've directed you to be judicious and have a developed process and to follow that. And so the question with that is, do you feel comfortable that you can receive all applications regardless of who they are and how their matching comes from, and give us and distribute those grants in an equitable way?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think, as of today, we're in our review process for this next round. There is a project in front of us for a sizable amount. Their match is in kind. The current law does not allow that. I have to follow that. So they will be getting a denial letter from us for that reason. Not necessarily the merits of the project, but again, that's one of our very first things we look at is first, if you claim you have a match, do you have? We've also run into a situation where, and I know you all hear this all the time, but a company said, well, if the state invests first, then we'll have all this follow-on capital. And we have taken the position that no, we are not, we are the follow-on capital. If you have private or federal dollars in hand today, you're eligible to move forward. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think, I think the way we're doing this now is working. I would point out again that we've had, through the 3 rounds, we've had almost 40 concept papers. And not until now has the in-kind match been an issue. We've kind of put our foot in the ground, and actually these companies have come up with cash if they've needed to.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to clarify. So if a company is either unwilling or unable to bring cash match to the table, and we consider in kind, which for some grants is normal and others it's not, I want to get clarification that in evaluating the true in-kind value, it indeed costs the state time and money to do that evaluation.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherwood, since this is somewhat a new discussion, our team has been putting our heads together on this, and we do think we would need to spend some resources outside of our office on a case-by-case basis. Some of these vary. These energy projects go from oil and gas to nuclear to rare earths. It really spans the whole spectrum. So I do think to make sure we can do this, we would need additional resources.
Any other further questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Mr. Chairman, based on the comments made yesterday by Chief Perkins, you will have some information to us sometime next week on the latest round that will be approved. And I'll follow that so you can answer it all at once. The reason I ask is based on the information you sent earlier in the week of the 150 million in Section 321, as of what our knowledge is today, there's about 93.3 million of that left. Yet you will be expending some of that in this round that you will hopefully have to us next week. So we would have, and then I could go on through the others. But just to make sure that we would have the most updated amounts remaining so that we know what to take action on, knowing you're taking applications, but you have not committed anything beyond what you can share with us next week, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that is correct. We would, on Tuesday's announcement, should everything, and just so you also are aware, When the review committee makes its recommendation, we then put that out to the public. So public can do a 10-day comment period. So the governor has all the information in front of him as to these projects. So the lists are on our website, and that was in the email that you referenced. So you can see the projects and the request, the recommended amounts. The final approval will be announced Tuesday. So if that full amount does get a full approval, it would bring the 150 you mentioned down to 65.3. Correct.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Repeat that number for the section 321.
Mr. Chairman, should that all get approved on Tuesday, it would bring our balance for just section 321 to $65,352,095.
And any change, the follow-up then, any change in your section 325 or 327 based on what will be potentially be approved on Tuesday? Do either of those funds have, any of the projects have funds coming from those sections?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. The fund would be, the funds used on Tuesday would be out of 321, solely out of 321.
Thank you.
Further questions? For Rob? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next, we've got Department of Health and Family Services. Corin, come on up.
So, Mr. Chairman, this is a request I'd made to LSO and to Director Schmidt and to the Children's Trust Fund on, in Unit 5908. They made an exception request to increase salaries. The governor approved that contingent upon HDR's approval of the classification change. HDR's approval came back different than the exception request. And so as we get ready to do markup, what I was hoping to do, Director Schmidt and Sarah, is to get an understanding of we would either accept the exception request and deny the governor's recommendation, or we look at accepting the governor's recommendation, and just want to know what that HDR recommendation does to your request and what you thought we needed to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Sarah Sarelson. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyoming Children's Trust Fund, and it's my first time in front of you, so it's a little nerve-wracking, but thank you for having me here. Representative Larson, we submitted that request prior to the budget being submitted and went through the process with HRD and ANI, and we agree with the recommendation from HRD for the reclassification, so specifically to the 9 position, the social services analyst position, instead of the business office position that would have been a 10, based on some good education from HRD and helping me and the Children's Trust Fund understand what it was and how the classification system worked. But we're in agreement with that recommendation for it as proposed in the way the HRD did. So we'll agree with that.
Chairman,
Go ahead.
following that up, so I believe that funding amount then would be $28,015. Is that correct?
That is, Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that is correct. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, see how easy that was?
Thank you.
Any other callbacks that we have brought up? Don?
Mr. Chairman, I believe your last callback that you've approved is in executive session.
Okay. So it's 11:20. So, yeah, do we have an idea of how long executive session is going to be?
Well, an hour is what we're trying to stick to.
An hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would ask that.
We'll come back at about 11:40
For executive.
for executive session.
11:45.
Okay.